Hey guys, tonight we begin an extraordinary journey into the shadows of one of history's most powerful dynasties. You know Henry VIII, the king with 6 wives, the man who broke from Rome, the larger-than-life monarch who dominated the Tudor era. But what if I told you that his most fascinating family member wasn't him at all? What if the real story of power, passion, and heartbreak belonged to someone history almost forgot entirely? Someone who was mocked by royalty, misunderstood by nations, and whose choices would echo through centuries of British history in ways that still matter today. Tonight we're uncovering the incredible true story of Margaret Tudor, Henry's older sister, a woman whose life was so scandalous, so dramatic, and so ahead of her time that even Hollywood couldn't have written it better. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Without her, there would be no British royal family as we know it today. Before we dive into this captivating tale together, I'd love it if you could show this story some love by hitting that subscribe button and giving it a like. But only if you genuinely connect with what we're exploring tonight. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Are you tucked in bed? Maybe with a cup of tea nearby? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a gentle fan for that perfect ambient sound. And let's step back 500 years to meet a princess who refused to be forgotten. Picture this. It's November 1489, and in the grand halls of Westminster Palace, a baby girl enters the world during one of the most tumultuous times in English history. Her father, Henry VII, has just won the crown at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the brutal Wars of the Roses. This tiny infant, named Margaret, doesn't know it yet, but she's about to become one of the most important pawns in European politics, and eventually one of its most rebellious queens. You see, Margaret Tudor wasn't just any princess. She was born into the first generation of a dynasty that would reshape England forever. But here's what's fascinating. While her younger brother Henry would become famous for his ego and his wives, Margaret possessed something far more dangerous: intelligence, independence, and an absolute refusal to be controlled by men. From her very first breath, Margaret's life was planned out like a chess game. Her father Henry VII was obsessed with legitimising the Tudor claim to the throne. Remember, he'd won his crown through conquest, not through an unshakable royal bloodline. Every marriage, every alliance, every decision was calculated to strengthen the dynasty. And Margaret, she was the perfect diplomatic tool. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where we start to see the woman who would later shock all of Europe. Even as a small child, Margaret displayed a fierce will that worried the court. While other princesses were taught to be silent and obedient, Margaret asked questions. She challenged her tutors. She demanded to know why her education was different from her brother's. Can you imagine being a little girl in the 1490s and essentially saying, "Why can't I learn Latin like Henry does?" That kind of curiosity and defiance was, well, it was revolutionary, and it was also dangerous. Now, you might be wondering, what made Margaret so different from other royal women of her time? Well, let me paint you a picture of what her daily life actually looked like, because it's going to surprise you. Her education was actually remarkable for a Tudor woman. She learned to read and write in English, French, and some Latin. She studied music, dancing, and needlework, sure. But she also absorbed politics by simply watching and listening. The Tudor court was a place where information was power, and Margaret learned early how to read people, how to understand the undercurrents of conversation, how to spot lies and manipulation. Think about this for a moment. While her little brother Henry was being groomed as the spare heir, never really expecting to be king, Margaret was being explicitly prepared to leave everything she knew and become the queen of a foreign nation. At age 4, negotiations for her marriage had already begun. 4 years old. Let that sink in. Her childhood was spent in a strange paradox of luxury and uncertainty. Yes, She had servants, beautiful clothes, the finest food, and tutors who taught her everything a princess should know. But she also lived with the constant knowledge that she was, essentially, a very expensive diplomatic gift waiting to be delivered. And here's something that really gets me. Margaret formed incredibly close bonds with her siblings, especially her sister Mary and her brother Henry. These weren't just royal siblings going through the motions of family life. By all accounts, they genuinely loved each other, played together, shared secrets, and created the kind of childhood memories that would later make their adult conflicts so much more heartbreaking. You know what's really remarkable about Margaret's early years? She lived through one of the most paranoid periods in English history. Her father Henry VII was constantly worried about pretenders to the throne, about rebellions, about the legitimacy of his rule. The royal family moved frequently between palaces, partly for pleasure, but partly for security. Margaret grew up understanding that power was fragile, that loyalty could shift overnight, and that even royal blood couldn't guarantee safety. This childhood shaped her in ways that would later confuse and frustrate everyone who tried to control her. She learned to be charming when necessary, but she also learned to be suspicious. She learned to value loyalty above almost everything else. But she also learned that sometimes survival meant making choices that others would call betrayal. By the time Margaret was 10 years old, her fate was sealed. The marriage negotiations that had been theoretical since she was 4 became very, very real. And the man chosen for her, James IV of Scotland, a king 15 years older than her, ruling a nation that had been England's enemy for generations. But here's the thing that makes Margaret's story so compelling. This arranged marriage that was supposed to make her a quiet, obedient queen in a foreign land, it was about to create one of the most independent, controversial and ultimately influential women in European history. And let me share something with you that most history books leave out. Margaret's reaction when she was told about her marriage wasn't the docile acceptance everyone expected. According to court records, she asked her father directly, "Will I ever see England again?" When he couldn't give her a straight answer, she reportedly said, "Then I will make Scotland my England." Think about that for a moment. 10-year-old girl, faced with the reality of permanent exile, doesn't break down in tears or beg to stay home. Instead, she makes a declaration that she will transform her new home into something that suits her. That's not just intelligence. That's the kind of strategic thinking that would later make her one of the most formidable political players in Europe. As we watch young Margaret prepare for a journey that would take her away from everything familiar, as we see her say goodbye to her beloved brother Henry for what she couldn't know would be the last peaceful time they'd share, we're witnessing the final moments of her life as a pawn in someone else's game. Because once Margaret Tudor reached Scotland, once she tasted real power and real independence, she would never, ever let anyone control her destiny again. And that decision, that refusal to be the quiet, manageable princess everyone expected, would set in motion events that are still shaping the British royal family today. But wait until you hear what happened during her journey to Scotland, the challenges she faced, the dangers she encountered, and the moment she first laid eyes on the man who would become her husband. It's a story of courage that will make you see this forgotten princess in a completely new light. In just a moment, we'll follow 13-year-old Margaret as she embarks on one of the most treacherous royal journeys in history, crossing into a land where everything from the language to the customs to the very air itself would test every lesson she'd learned about survival, power, and what it truly means to be a queen. So here we are, watching a 13-year-old girl prepare for what would become one of the most challenging royal educations in European history. Margaret Tudor's early years weren't just about learning to curtsy and play the lute. They were about survival training for a world that would demand everything from her. Let me take you inside the royal nursery at Westminster Palace, because what happened there shaped the woman who would later defy kings and kingdoms. Margaret's education was overseen by some of the most brilliant minds in England. But here's what's fascinating. Her parents knew they were preparing her for something unprecedented. You see, Most royal daughters were educated to be decorative wives to foreign princes. They learned enough to make pleasant conversation, to manage a household, maybe to write a letter or two. But Margaret, she was being groomed to be a political force. Her tutors included scholars who had studied at Oxford and Cambridge. And they didn't just teach her the basics. Margaret learned to speak French so fluently that French ambassadors later remarked she sounded like she'd been born in Paris. Her Latin was strong enough that she could read papal documents and understand legal terminology. But here's the really remarkable part. She also learned what we might call emotional intelligence. She was taught to read facial expressions, to understand the subtext in conversations, to recognise when someone was lying to her. Can you imagine being 12 years old and having lessons on how to detect deception? That's not typical princess training. That's spycraft. And here's something that gives me chills every time I think about it. Margaret's governess, Lady Guildford, kept detailed records of the princess's progress. In one report from 1502, she wrote that Margaret had an uncommon ability to remember faces and voices, even after months of separation. She could recall conversations word for word, could mimic accents perfectly, and had what Lady Guildford called an unsettling talent for understanding what people truly want. Those skills, they weren't party tricks. They were going to save her life multiple times in the years to come. Now, let's talk about something most people don't realise about Margaret's childhood. She was incredibly close to her younger brother Henry. I mean, really close. They shared tutors, they played together constantly, and they developed this almost telepathic understanding of each other. Henry was only 2 years younger, but Margaret took on this protective, big sister role that shaped both of their personalities. She taught Henry how to read people the way she'd been taught. She shared her political lessons with him. And perhaps most importantly, she showed him what it looked like to refuse to back down from a challenge. Sound familiar? That famous Tudor stubbornness that would later make Henry VIII so... well, Henry VIII. A lot of that came from watching his big sister. But here's where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. In 1502, when Margaret was 13, everything changed. Her older brother Arthur, the heir to the throne, died suddenly. Just like that. Henry went from being the spare to being the future King of England. And Margaret? She went from being a valuable diplomatic asset to being absolutely crucial to England's survival. Because now, with Arthur dead and Henry still young and unmarried, Margaret represented the only immediate way to secure alliances through marriage. The pressure on her became enormous. Every conversation, every lesson, every moment of her day was suddenly focused on preparing her for a marriage that could determine England's future. I want you to imagine being 13 years old and having the weight of an entire kingdom placed on your shoulders. Not metaphorically, literally. Margaret's marriage negotiations weren't just about her personal happiness. They were about whether England would have allies or enemies, whether there would be war or peace, whether the Tudor dynasty would survive or fall. And the man chosen for her, James IV of Scotland, was everything Margaret had been taught to expect in a husband, and absolutely nothing like what she'd hoped for. He was 29 years old to her 13. He was known for his military prowess, his intelligence, and his political cunning. But he was also known for something else. His temper. Scottish nobles who visited the English court whispered stories about James's rages, about how he'd thrown furniture when angered, about how he'd once had a servant imprisoned for bringing him cold soup. These weren't exactly the qualities that would reassure a teenage bride, but here's what's remarkable about Margaret's reaction to all of this. She didn't panic. Instead, she started what we might call her own intelligence operation. She began cultivating friendships with Scottish visitors to court. She learned Scottish customs, picked up pieces of the language, and most importantly, she started gathering information about her future husband. What she discovered was both reassuring and terrifying. James IV was indeed intelligent and well-educated. He spoke multiple languages, was interested in science and learning, and was considered one of the most cultured monarchs in Europe. but he was also fiercely proud, absolutely convinced of his own righteousness, and had a history of making impulsive decisions that affected thousands of lives. In other words, he was a lot like the Tudors. Margaret's final months in England were spent in intensive preparation for her new life. She learned Scottish dances, studied maps of Scotland until she could navigate them in her sleep, and practiced conversations in Scottish dialect. But perhaps most importantly, she learned about power. Her father, Henry VII, sat her down for a series of conversations that were part fatherly advice, part political briefing and part survival manual. He explained that as Queen of Scotland, she would need to navigate between loyalty to her birth family and loyalty to her new country. He warned her that there would be times when England and Scotland's interests conflicted, and she would have to choose sides. And then he told her something that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. "Remember," he said, "you are a Tudor first, a Queen second, and a wife third. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." That advice? It was going to create some serious problems down the road. The night before Margaret left England, she and Henry had their last conversation as children. They sat in the palace gardens, and according to court records, they made a pact. They promised each other that no matter what happened, no matter what political pressures they faced, they would always be brother and sister first. That promise would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. Have you ever had to leave everything familiar behind and start over somewhere completely new? Maybe you've moved to a different country or started at a new school where you didn't know anyone. That nervous excitement, that mixture of anticipation and terror. Multiply that by about 1,000, and you're getting close to what Margaret felt as she prepared for her journey to Scotland, because this wasn't just moving to a new place. This was entering a completely different world, with different customs, different dangers, and different rules. And at 13 years old, Margaret was about to discover just how much strength she actually possessed. As we prepare to follow Margaret on her journey north, as we watch her say goodbye to the only life she'd ever known, we're witnessing one of history's most remarkable transformations. The protected English princess was about to become something entirely new. Something that would shock everyone who thought they knew what royal women were capable of. But first, she had to survive the journey itself. And let me tell you, what happened on that treacherous road to Scotland would test every lesson she'd learned about diplomacy, courage, and the delicate art of staying alive when everyone around you has their own agenda. The morning of June 27th, 1503, dawned grey and misty over Richmond Palace, and 13-year-old Margaret Tudor was about to embark on what historians would later call the most politically significant bridal journey in British history. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Margaret wasn't just travelling to her wedding. She was walking into what amounted to a diplomatic minefield, where one wrong step could literally start a war. Let me paint you a picture of what this journey actually looked like. Because it's nothing like the romantic fairy tale processions you see in movies. Margaret's wedding party consisted of over 1,500 people. Think about that for a moment. 1,500 people travelling together in 1503, when roads were little more than muddy tracks, and bridges were luxury items that most rivers simply didn't have. The procession stretched for nearly 2 miles when fully assembled. At the front rode the Earl of Surrey with a contingent of armed guards. Because let's be honest, a 13-year-old English princess travelling through the borderlands between England and Scotland was basically a walking target for anyone with political ambitions or old grudges to settle. Behind the guards came Margaret's household staff, her ladies-in-waiting, her chaplains, her physicians, and enough servants to manage what was essentially a travelling palace. Then came the wagons. Dozens and dozens of wagons carrying her dowry, her trousseau, wedding gifts, furniture, tapestries, and enough food to feed the army of people accompanying her. But here's the detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. Margaret travelled in a specially constructed litter that could be sealed shut if they encountered hostile forces. It was basically a portable panic room disguised as a royal carriage. That tells you everything you need to know about how dangerous this journey was considered to be. The first few days went smoothly enough. They travelled north through England, stopping at great houses where Margaret was entertained by nobles eager to curry favour with the future Queen of Scotland. But as they approached the Scottish border, everything changed. You have to understand, the relationship between England and Scotland in 1503 was complicated, doesn't even begin to cover it. These two nations had been at war, on and off, for centuries. The border regions were controlled by powerful families who switched loyalties based on who could offer them the best deal at any given moment. Trust was a luxury nobody could afford. And into this volatile situation rides a 13-year-old English princess with a dowry worth more than most kingdoms' annual revenues. The moment Margaret's procession crossed into Scotland, she encountered her first real test of the diplomatic skills she'd been learning her entire life. A group of Scottish border lords had assembled to escort her to Edinburgh, but their leader, the Earl of Bothwell, made it clear that their protection came with conditions. According to contemporary accounts, Bothwell approached Margaret's litter and demanded to speak with her directly. When her English guards tried to intervene, he reportedly said, "I'll speak with my future queen, not her English nursemaids." The tension in that moment must have been incredible. Here's this 13-year-old girl, hundreds of miles from home, facing down a Scottish lord who could probably have her entire party slaughtered if he felt like it. But Margaret's response, absolutely brilliant. She emerged from her litter, looked Bothwell directly in the eye and said in perfect French, "My lord, I'm honoured by your escort, and I look forward to learning the customs of my new homeland from men of your evident wisdom and experience." French was the diplomatic language of the time, and by speaking it instead of English, Margaret was essentially saying, "I'm not your enemy, I'm your queen, and I'm here to learn from you, not to conquer you." Bothwell was reportedly so impressed that he not only pledged his protection, but actually dismissed half his men to show that she was safe with him. That moment, 13-year-old girl diffusing a potentially explosive situation through pure diplomatic instinct. That's when Margaret Tudor announced to the world that she was going to be a very different kind of queen. But the challenges were just beginning. The journey from the border to Edinburgh normally took about 5 days. Margaret's procession took nearly 3 weeks. Why? Because every Scottish noble along the route wanted to meet her, to size her up, to figure out what kind of queen she was going to be. Each stop was a test. At Dalkeith Palace, she was presented with a wild Scottish terrier as a gift, and was expected to handle the aggressive little dog without flinching. She not only managed it, but apparently charmed the animal so thoroughly that it followed her for the rest of the journey. At another stop, she was challenged to a traditional Scottish dance by the daughter of a local lord. Margaret had been learning Scottish dances as part of her preparation, but performing them in front of a crowd of sceptical Scots who were judging every step. That takes serious confidence. By all accounts, she not only kept up, but actually improved on some of the traditional moves, incorporating elements of English court dance that the Scots found fascinating. Can you imagine being 13 and having to essentially audition for an entire kingdom? Every smile, every word, every gesture was being analysed for signs of weakness, arrogance, or incompetence. But here's what's remarkable. Margaret seemed to thrive under this pressure. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming more confident, more poised, and more charismatic with each challenge she faced. It was like she was discovering parts of herself she never knew existed. The most significant test came when they reached Lamberton Kirk, a small church near the Scottish border where Margaret was to be formally welcomed into Scotland. James IV had sent representatives to perform a proxy marriage ceremony, basically a practice wedding to make Margaret officially Scottish before she actually met her husband. This ceremony was Margaret's first real taste of Scottish culture, and it was nothing like the refined English court she was used to. Scottish nobles were rougher, louder, more direct than their English counterparts. They drank more, laughed more, and had absolutely no patience for the subtle diplomatic language that Margaret had been taught to use. During the ceremony, one of James's representatives reportedly asked Margaret if she understood that she was now Scottish, not English, and that her loyalty belonged to Scotland. It was a direct challenge, posed in front of dozens of witnesses who would report every word back to their king. Margaret's response has been recorded in several contemporary sources, and it's absolutely perfect. She said, "My lord, I am Scottish by law, English by birth, and Christian by the grace of God. I hope to prove myself worthy of all three." Boom! In one sentence, she acknowledged Scottish law, honoured her English heritage, and appealed to the universal Christian identity that both kingdoms shared. The Scottish nobles were reportedly so impressed that they spent the rest of the evening trying to outdo each other in offering her gifts and pledges of loyalty. But here's the thing that really gets me about this entire journey. Margaret was keeping detailed notes the whole time. Not just about the political situation, but about everything. Scottish customs, regional dialects, family alliances, economic conditions, military strengths and weaknesses. By the time she reached Edinburgh, she probably knew more about the practical realities of ruling Scotland than many of the Scottish nobles did. Think about that level of preparation and attention to detail from a 13-year-old. This wasn't just survival instinct. This was strategic thinking at the highest level. As Margaret's procession finally approached Edinburgh, as she caught her first glimpse of the ancient castle perched on its volcanic rock, she was no longer the protected English princess who had left Richmond Palace 3 weeks earlier. She had become something new. Something that Scotland had never seen before. And waiting for her in that castle was James IV, a man whose reputation had preceded him in ways both thrilling and terrifying. Their first meeting would set the tone for a marriage that would reshape the balance of power in Northern Europe. But before we witness that historic encounter, before we see how a 13-year-old English princess and a 29-year-old Scottish king size each other up for the first time, we need to understand exactly what Margaret was walking into. The Scottish court wasn't just different from the English court. It was like stepping into a completely different century, where the rules of power, politics, and survival operated on principles that would challenge everything Margaret thought she knew about being royal. When Margaret Tudor first laid eyes on Edinburgh Castle rising from its ancient volcanic rock on August 1st, 1503, she was stepping into a world that would have seemed almost alien to someone raised in the refined English court. But here's what makes this moment absolutely extraordinary. Instead of being intimidated, Margaret was about to discover that she was perfectly suited for the wild, passionate, and utterly unpredictable world of Scottish royalty. Let me take you inside Holyrood Palace on that first evening, because what happened there revealed so much about both Margaret and the man she was about to marry. The Scottish court was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Where the English court operated on subtle diplomatic language and carefully orchestrated ceremonies, the Scottish court was raw, immediate, and intensely personal. James IV didn't wait for formal presentations or elaborate protocols. The moment Margaret's procession arrived, he came striding out of the palace to meet her. And I mean striding. Contemporary accounts describe him as practically running down the steps, which was completely against royal protocol but absolutely typical of James's impulsive nature. Picture this scene. A 13-year-old girl who has just completed one of the most grueling diplomatic journeys in royal history. Tired, probably nervous, stepping out of her travel litter to meet her future husband for the first time. And instead of some stiff, formal ceremony, here comes this tall, athletic 29-year-old king, grinning broadly, speaking in rapid Scottish accented French because he's too excited to wait for translators. Margaret's first words to James have been recorded by multiple witnesses, and they're absolutely perfect. When he apologised for the informal welcome, she reportedly said, "Your Majesty, informality is honesty, and honesty is the foundation of trust. I prefer it greatly to ceremony. The Scottish nobles who heard this exchange were stunned. Here was this tiny English princess not only keeping up with their notoriously unpredictable king, but actually matching his directness with wit and diplomacy. It was like watching two master chess players recognise each other across the board. But here's where the story gets really interesting. James IV was not what Margaret had been expecting at all. Yes, he was older than her, and yes, he had that famous Scottish temper. But he was also one of the most cultured intellectual monarchs in Europe. He spoke at least 7 languages fluently, was deeply interested in science and medicine, and had actually performed surgical operations himself because he was fascinated by anatomy. James was also a Renaissance prince in the truest sense. He patronised artists, collected books, funded explorations, and maintained correspondence with scholars across Europe. His court attracted intellectuals, inventors, and artists from all over the continent. In many ways, it was more cosmopolitan than the English court Margaret had left behind. And Margaret, she was absolutely fascinated by all of it. Her English education had prepared her to be curious, to ask questions, to engage with ideas. Suddenly she found herself in a place where intellectual curiosity wasn't just tolerated. It was celebrated. Within days of her arrival, Margaret was attending meetings of James's council, not as a silent observer but as an active participant. James would translate the proceedings into French for her, and she would offer observations that often surprised the Scottish nobles with their insight. One particular incident really shows how quickly Margaret adapted to Scottish political culture. During a discussion about border security, one of the nobles made a dismissive comment about English treachery. There was this awful moment of silence as everyone realised they'd just insulted their future queen's homeland in front of her. Margaret's response? She looked the noble directly in the eye and said, "My lord, having recently travelled through the border regions, I can assure you that treachery knows no nationality. It springs from desperation, opportunity, and poor governance, all of which can be addressed by wise leadership, regardless of which side of the border it comes from." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Margaret had just demonstrated that she could take criticism of England, turn it into a broader political observation, and challenge the Scottish nobles to be better leaders, all without losing her temper or backing down. James was reportedly so impressed that he asked her to attend all future council meetings. But it wasn't all politics and intellectual discussions. Margaret also had to navigate the social aspects of the Scottish court. And this is where things got really interesting. Scottish noblewomen were, how do I put this diplomatically, a lot more assertive than their English counterparts. They spoke their minds directly. They participated in political discussions. They rode horses like they were part cavalry charge. And they had absolutely no patience for the kind of subtle, indirect communication that Margaret had been taught was appropriate for royal ladies. At first, this was challenging. Margaret's English training had taught her to be influential through suggestion, to guide conversations rather than dominate them. But the Scottish women expected her to state her opinions clearly and defend them vigorously. It was like learning a completely new social language. But here's what's remarkable. Margaret didn't just adapt to this more direct style, she excelled at it. Within weeks, she was holding her own in debates with some of the most formidable women in Scotland. She learned to argue her points with passion while still maintaining royal dignity. She discovered that she actually preferred the honesty of direct confrontation to the subtle manoeuvring she had grown up with. And James, he was clearly falling in love with this transformation. Contemporary accounts describe him as being utterly captivated by Margaret's intelligence and adaptability. He would seek out her opinions on everything from foreign policy to architectural plans for palace renovations. But perhaps the most telling moment came during Margaret's first experience with the traditional Scottish hunt. Now, English royal hunts were fairly civilised affairs. Lots of ceremony, careful protocols, servants to handle the dangerous parts. Scottish hunts were basically controlled chaos involving wild terrain, unpredictable weather, and the very real possibility of serious injury. Margaret could have easily begged off, claiming feminine delicacy or English inexperience. Instead, she insisted on participating fully. She learned to handle a Scottish hunting horse, mastered the use of a crossbow, and according to one witness, actually brought down a stag on her third attempt. The Scottish nobles were astonished. Here was this petite English princess keeping up with seasoned Scottish hunters in some of the most challenging terrain in Europe. But what really impressed them was her attitude. She didn't complain about the cold, didn't flinch when her horse nearly stumbled on rocky ground, and actually laughed when she got soaked in a sudden downpour. James reportedly told his closest advisor, "She's not what I expected. She's better. She has the mind of a diplomat and the heart of a Scot." Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to completely reinvent who you were? Maybe starting a new job where the culture was totally different, or moving to a place where social norms were nothing like what you grew up with. That mixture of excitement and terror, of discovering capabilities you didn't know you possessed. That's exactly what Margaret was experiencing. But here's the crucial thing to understand. Margaret wasn't just adapting to Scottish culture. She was beginning to thrive in it. The directness, the passion, the intellectual intensity. It was like she'd found a world that matched her natural temperament in ways that the English court never had. And James was discovering that his young bride wasn't going to be the malleable political asset he'd expected. She was going to be a partner, a collaborator, and eventually a formidable queen who would challenge him in ways he'd never anticipated. As their wedding day approached, as the final preparations were made for one of the most politically significant ceremonies in European history, both Margaret and James were beginning to realise that their marriage was going to be unlike anything either of them had imagined. But first came the wedding itself, a celebration that would last for days, involve thousands of guests, and officially unite two kingdoms that had been enemies for centuries. What happened during those festivities would set the tone for everything that followed, including decisions that would ultimately reshape the British Isles forever. What unfolded on August 8th, 1503 in the ancient Abbey of Holyrood was more than just a royal wedding. It was a political earthquake that would reshape the balance of power in Europe. But here's what makes Margaret Tudor's wedding absolutely fascinating. It was also the moment when a 13-year-old girl discovered she had the power to captivate not just a king, but an entire kingdom. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, which Scottish observers took as a good omen. Margaret had spent the previous evening in prayer and preparation, but according to her ladies-in-waiting, she showed no signs of the nervousness you might expect from a teenage bride. Instead, she seemed almost excited, like she was about to step onto a stage she'd been rehearsing for her entire life. The ceremony itself was designed to be a spectacle that would announce to all of Europe that Scotland was now a major player in continental politics. James had spared no expense. The abbey was decorated with tapestries from France, golden vessels from Italy, and flowers that had been cultivated specifically for the occasion in the palace gardens. But here's the detail that really gets me. Margaret insisted on walking to the altar unescorted. In royal weddings of this period, brides were typically led by their fathers or male relatives, symbolising the transfer of authority from one man to another. Margaret's father wasn't there, of course, but she could have been escorted by any number of English nobles in her party. Instead, she chose to walk alone. When asked why, she reportedly said, "I come to this marriage of my own will as a queen, not as a possession to be transferred." The symbolism was impossible to miss. Margaret Tudor was announcing that she intended to be a partner in this union, not a subordinate. The moment she appeared in the abbey doorway, the entire congregation fell silent. Margaret was wearing a gown that had taken English seamstresses 6 months to complete. It was made of cloth of gold with sleeves of crimson velvet, decorated with pearls and precious stones that caught the light from hundreds of candles. But it wasn't just the dress that stunned everyone. It was Margaret herself. Contemporary accounts describe her as radiating confidence and grace that seemed far beyond her 13 years. One Scottish noble wrote to his wife that Margaret moved like she was born to rule kingdoms, and a visiting French ambassador reported that she had the bearing of a woman who knows her own worth. James, waiting at the altar in his finest robes, was reportedly so struck by Margaret's appearance that he actually took a step forward before catching himself and remembering royal protocol, the look that passed between them in that moment. Witnesses described it as electric, like watching two people recognise something in each other that no one else could see. The ceremony itself was conducted in Latin, with translations provided in English, French, and Scots Gaelic to ensure that everyone present understood the full significance of what was happening. When Margaret spoke her vows, she did so in clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the abbey. There was no hesitation, no girlish whisper. This was a queen accepting her crown. But here's where things get really interesting. The wedding festivities lasted for 17 days. 17 days of tournaments, banquets, entertainments, and celebrations that cost James nearly a third of Scotland's annual revenue. Why so elaborate? Because this wasn't just a party. It was an extended diplomatic conference disguised as a celebration. Representatives from every major European power were in attendance. And James was determined to show them that Scotland was wealthy, sophisticated, and politically significant. Margaret, meanwhile, was essentially auditioning for the role of queen in front of the most important people in Europe, and she absolutely nailed it. During the first banquet, Margaret was seated between the French ambassador and a papal legate. These were men accustomed to dealing with the most powerful women in Europe, and they expected to make polite conversation with a teenage bride before moving on to more important discussions. Instead, they found themselves engaged in a 3-hour conversation about European politics, religious reform, and trade policies. The French ambassador later wrote to his king that Margaret speaks with the wisdom of a seasoned diplomat and the insight of someone who has studied the art of governance. The papal legate was so impressed that he reportedly told James, "Your Majesty has not just gained a wife, you have gained a counsellor who will make Scotland stronger." The tournaments held in Margaret's honour revealed another side of her character that surprised everyone. Scottish tournaments were rough, dangerous affairs where serious injuries were common and death was always a possibility. English royal ladies typically watched from covered pavilions, retiring to private chambers whenever the action became too intense. Margaret, she insisted on sitting in the front row of the royal box, in full view of the action. When one knight was badly injured in a fall, she immediately dispatched her own physician to tend to him. When another fighter's horse was hurt, she sent money from her personal funds to ensure the animal received proper care. But perhaps most remarkably, when James himself entered the lists to compete, Margaret stood up and publicly offered him her favour. A silk scarf that he could wear as a token of her support. This was a deeply personal gesture that announced to everyone present that their marriage was more than just political convenience. There was genuine affection between them. James, wearing Margaret's scarf, proceeded to win every event he entered that day. Coincidence? Maybe. But the crowd certainly interpreted it as proof that their new queen brought good fortune to their king. The evening entertainments were equally revealing. Margaret participated in the dancing, the storytelling, and the musical performances that were traditional at Scottish celebrations. But she also introduced elements from English court culture that fascinated the Scottish nobles. She organised a series of what she called conversations, essentially early versions of the literary salons that would become popular in later centuries. Small groups would gather to discuss poetry, philosophy, or current events, with Margaret skillfully guiding the discussions to ensure everyone felt included. These conversations were a huge hit because they allowed the Scottish nobles to show off their education and wit in ways that traditional entertainments didn't. Margaret had essentially created a new form of court entertainment that made everyone feel more intelligent and sophisticated. Have you ever been to a party where someone just had this natural ability to make every conversation more interesting, to bring out the best in everyone around them? That was Margaret during these wedding festivities. She wasn't just participating in Scottish court life, she was actively improving it, But perhaps the most significant moment came during the final banquet. When James stood to address his guests, in addition to thanking everyone for attending, he made an announcement that shocked both the Scottish and English representatives present. He declared that Margaret would be given a formal role in Scottish governance, serving as his advisor on foreign policy and participating as a full member of the Royal Council. This was almost unprecedented. Royal wives were expected to influence their husbands privately, not to hold official political positions. Margaret's response to this announcement reveals so much about her character. She stood, thanked James for his confidence in her abilities, and then said something that would be quoted for centuries afterward. "I promise to serve Scotland with the same dedication I would serve England, for I have learned that true loyalty means working for the good of all people, regardless of the borders that separate them." The Scottish nobles erupted in applause. Here was their new queen essentially declaring that she would put Scottish interests first while still honouring her English heritage. It was exactly what they wanted to hear, delivered with a sophistication that made it clear this was no mere political platitude, but a carefully considered position. As the wedding festivities finally drew to a close, as the foreign guests began their journeys home, Margaret and James were left to begin their life together as King and Queen of Scotland. The honeymoon period, both literal and political, was about to begin. But what nobody could have predicted was how quickly their fairy tale beginning would be tested by the harsh realities of 16th century politics. Within months, Margaret would face challenges that would force her to choose between the lessons of her English upbringing and the demands of her Scottish crown. Looking back, those first few years of Margaret's marriage to James IV would later be remembered as the golden age of their relationship. But even fairy tales have their complications, and Margaret was about to discover that being Queen of Scotland meant navigating political waters far more treacherous than anything she'd encountered during her English upbringing. The honeymoon period, quite literally, lasted about 6 months. During those blissful early days, Margaret and James seemed to be the perfect royal couple. She was brilliant at state ceremonies, charming with foreign ambassadors, and absolutely beloved by the Scottish people. James, meanwhile, was clearly head over heels in love with his young queen and delighted in showing her off to visiting dignitaries. But here's where the story takes its first dramatic turn. Margaret's relationship with James wasn't happening in a vacuum. She was also trying to maintain her connection with her family in England, particularly with her beloved brother Henry, who was still just the heir apparent at this point. The letters between Margaret and Henry during this period reveal so much about both of their personalities. Margaret's correspondence shows a young woman desperately trying to balance her loyalty to her new homeland with her love for her birth family. Henry's letters, meanwhile, reveal a teenage boy who missed his sister terribly and was beginning to show signs of the possessive, controlling personality that would later define his reign. In one particularly telling exchange from 1504, Henry wrote to Margaret complaining that she seemed more Scottish than English in her recent letters. Margaret's response is absolutely brilliant, and a little heartbreaking. She wrote back, "Dearest brother, I'm Scottish by choice, English by birth, and your sister by love. These three loyalties need not conflict unless you insist they must." But Henry was insisting they must. And this is where we start to see the first cracks in what had seemed like a perfect political arrangement. The problem was that Henry VII's foreign policy goals and James IV's ambitions were beginning to diverge in ways that put Margaret in an impossible position. England wanted Scotland to remain a useful but subordinate ally. Scotland, meanwhile, was developing its own relationships with European powers, particularly France, that didn't necessarily align with English interests. Margaret found herself caught in the middle, trying to serve as a bridge between two kingdoms that were slowly but steadily moving apart. And here's what makes her situation so fascinating. She was actually good at it. Her diplomatic instincts were incredible, and she managed to prevent several potential conflicts through careful negotiation and what we might call emotional intelligence. For example, in 1505 there was a dispute over Scottish merchants trading with French ports that English nobles considered hostile. The issue could have escalated into a serious diplomatic crisis, but Margaret proposed a solution that allowed Scottish merchants to continue their French trade while providing England with valuable intelligence about French military preparations. Both sides got what they needed. The conflict was avoided, and Margaret's reputation as a skilled negotiator was enhanced. James was so impressed that he began consulting her on all major foreign policy decisions, but success in diplomacy couldn't solve the more personal challenges Margaret was facing as a young queen. One of the biggest adjustments was simply the difference in how royal marriages worked in Scotland versus England. English royal marriages tended to be fairly formal affairs. Husbands and wives had their separate households, their separate duties, and they came together for ceremonial occasions and, hopefully, for producing heirs. Personal affection was nice if it happened, but it wasn't expected. Scottish royal marriages were much more intense. James expected Margaret to be not just his queen, but his closest confidant, his political advisor, his intellectual equal, and his passionate romantic partner all at the same time. For a 14-year-old who had been raised to compartmentalise her roles, this was overwhelming. And then there was the issue of James's temper, which Margaret was learning to navigate with varying degrees of success. James IV was known throughout Europe for his explosive rages, but also for his equally dramatic reconciliations. He could go from shouting about some perceived slight to writing love poetry in the span of a single afternoon. Margaret's English training had taught her to diffuse conflicts through diplomatic language and strategic withdrawal, but James interpreted diplomatic language as coldness and strategic withdrawal as rejection. What he wanted was passionate engagement, even if that meant passionate arguments. One incident that really illustrates this cultural clash happened in late 1505. Margaret had disagreed with James about a proposed alliance with a particular Scottish clan, and she had expressed her concerns in the careful, indirect manner she'd been taught was appropriate for royal ladies. James apparently exploded, accusing her of being English ice in Scottish fire, and storming out of their chambers. Margaret, following her English training, decided to give him space to cool down before attempting reconciliation, but James interpreted her restraint as indifference. For 3 days, they barely spoke, and the entire court was walking on eggshells, waiting for the royal reconciliation that seemed like it might never come. Finally, one of Margaret's Scottish ladies-in-waiting took her aside and explained that in Scotland, when someone you loved was angry with you, you fought back. You didn't withdraw diplomatically. You engaged passionately. So Margaret marched into James's private study, where he was brooding over correspondence, and basically gave him a piece of her mind. She told him that his temper was childish, that his expectations were unreasonable, and that if he wanted a partner instead of an ornament, he needed to treat her like an equal instead of a possession. James's response? He started laughing. Apparently, seeing his composed English queen finally lose her temper delighted him so much that he completely forgot what they'd been fighting about in the first place. From that point on, their relationship took on a new dynamic. Margaret learned to express her opinions more directly, and James learned to appreciate her diplomatic skills even when they frustrated him. They developed what contemporary observers described as a passionate but respectful partnership. But here's where things get complicated. Margaret was also dealing with the pressure to produce an heir. She'd suffered 2 miscarriages in her first 2 years of marriage, which was heartbreaking personally and worrying politically. In the 16th century, a queen's primary job was to ensure the succession, and Margaret's inability to carry a pregnancy to term was becoming a source of anxiety for everyone involved. The Scottish nobles were beginning to whisper about whether the marriage was cursed. The English were worried about their diplomatic investment, and Margaret herself was struggling with feelings of failure and inadequacy. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you was watching and waiting for you to achieve something that felt completely beyond your control? That pressure, that sense that your personal struggles were somehow public property. That's what Margaret was dealing with at 17 years old. The irony is that in every other aspect of being queen, Margaret was exceeding everyone's expectations. She had mastered Scottish court politics, earn the respect of the nobles, and become genuinely popular with the common people. But none of that mattered if she couldn't produce a son. The pressure was so intense that Margaret actually wrote to her brother Henry asking for advice on dealing with public expectations. Henry's response reveals a lot about his own understanding of royal responsibility. He wrote back telling her that queens who couldn't fulfill their primary duty had historically been set aside for the good of the realm. It wasn't exactly the emotional support Margaret was looking for from her beloved brother. But then, in 1507, everything changed. Margaret finally carried a pregnancy to term and gave birth to a son, James. The relief and celebration were incredible. Not just because Scotland finally had an heir, but because Margaret had proven herself capable of fulfilling what everyone considered her most important role. The birth of Prince James transformed Margaret's position in Scotland completely. She was no longer the promising young queen who might succeed. She was the mother of the future king, which gave her a level of political security and influence she'd never experienced before. But as Margaret was about to discover, having power and knowing how to use it wisely were two very different things. And the choices she would make in the coming years would test not just her political skills, but her understanding of what it truly meant to be caught between two worlds that were moving inexorably towards conflict. Everything changed on a cold September morning in 1513, when a blood-soaked messenger stumbled into Holyrood Palace with news that would shatter Margaret's world forever. But to understand the full impact of what happened at Flodden Field, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to the moment when Margaret Tudor made the most difficult choice of her life. And chose wrong. The year 1513 had started with such promise. Margaret, now 23 and the mother of 4-year-old Prince James, had finally found her stride as Queen of Scotland. She was respected, influential, and genuinely happy in her marriage. But then her brother Henry VIII decided to invade France, and everything Margaret had worked to build came crashing down around her. Here's where the story gets absolutely heartbreaking. Henry didn't just ask for Scottish support in his French campaign, he demanded it. In letter after letter, he reminded Margaret that her first loyalty should be to England, that she was his sister before she was James's wife, and that supporting England against France was her duty as a Tudor. But Scotland had its own treaty with France, the old alliance that had protected Scottish independence for centuries. James IV was honour-bound to support France if England attacked, and more than that, he genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. So Margaret found herself in the exact situation she had been dreading for 10 years. Her brother and her husband were on opposite sides of a war, and both expected her complete loyalty. The letters between Margaret and Henry during this period are absolutely devastating to read. You can see Margaret trying desperately to find some middle ground, some way to prevent the conflict that seemed inevitable. In one particularly painful exchange, she wrote to Henry, "I beg you, as your sister who loves you, do not force me to choose between my birth family and my chosen family. There must be another way." Henry's response was cold and uncompromising. He wrote back, "There is no choice to be made. You're a Tudor, act like one." Meanwhile, James was facing his own pressures. The Scottish nobles were pushing for war with England. The French were sending gold and promises of support, and his own sense of honour demanded that he honour Scotland's treaty obligations. But he also loved his wife, and understood the impossible position she was in. The scene that unfolded in the royal chambers one evening in May 1513 has been recorded by multiple witnesses, and it's one of the most emotionally devastating moments in royal history. James came to Margaret's rooms to tell her that he had decided to support France and invade England. Margaret's response was immediate and passionate. She begged him not to go to war, reminded him of his responsibilities to Scotland and their son, and finally broke down in tears, pleading with him to find another way. James's reply reveals so much about both of their characters. According to court records, he said, "My love, I cannot be the king Scotland needs if I am not the man I need to be. And I cannot be that man if I break my word when it becomes inconvenient. Margaret understood honour, duty and political necessity, but she also understood something that James, in his idealism, seemed to miss. This war was going to destroy them. In her final attempt to prevent disaster, Margaret did something unprecedented. She wrote directly to the Pope, asking him to intervene and prevent Christian kingdoms from destroying each other. It was a brilliant diplomatic move that could have changed everything, if it had arrived in time, but by the time Margaret's letter reached Rome, events were already in motion. James had crossed the border into England with the largest Scottish army ever assembled. Over 30,000 men, including most of the Scottish nobility and a significant portion of Scotland's adult male population. What happened next is one of the most complete military disasters in Scottish history. On September 9th, 1513, at Flodden Field in Northumberland, the Scottish army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. James IV was killed, along with most of his nobles, his bishops, and thousands of common soldiers, in a single afternoon. Scotland lost not just a battle but an entire generation of leadership. It was a catastrophe so complete that contemporary accounts describe it as the worst day in Scottish history. But for Margaret, the news was even more devastating than the military implications. She hadn't just lost a war. She had lost her husband, her partner, her closest friend, and the father of her children. The messenger who brought the news to Holyrood Palace described Margaret's reaction as silent shock, followed by terrible understanding. She didn't scream or faint or rage against fate. Instead, she asked a single question. "Are you certain it was the king?" When the messenger confirmed that James's body had been identified, Margaret reportedly nodded once and said, "Then Scotland has lost a king, and I have lost everything that mattered." But here's what makes Margaret Tudor absolutely extraordinary. She didn't have time to grieve. Because with James dead and her son still a child, Margaret had just become the most powerful person in Scotland, and possibly the most vulnerable. The Scottish nobility who had survived Flodden immediately began manoeuvring for control of the regency. Some wanted to crown the 4-year-old James V immediately and rule in his name. Others proposed bringing in French advisors to guide Scotland through this crisis. Still others suggested negotiating some kind of union with England to prevent future disasters. Margaret, meanwhile, was dealing with political realities that would have challenged the most experienced rulers. Scotland was essentially defenceless. The treasury was depleted from funding the war, and there were credible rumours that Henry VIII was planning to invade and claim Scotland for England, while the kingdom was weak. In the days immediately following Flodden, Margaret displayed political skills that amazed even her critics. She secured the royal castle, placed loyal guards around her son, and began reaching out to the surviving Scottish nobles to build a coalition that could maintain stability. But she also made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Desperate to protect her son and maintain her own position, Margaret sent a secret message to her brother Henry, essentially offering to help him establish English influence over Scotland in exchange for his protection. It was a reasonable political calculation from someone in an impossible situation. But it was also a betrayal of everything James had died for. And when word of Margaret's negotiations leaked, and it always leaked in 16th century politics, it destroyed her credibility with the Scottish nobles completely. Have you ever made a decision in a moment of crisis that seemed logical at the time, but haunted you forever afterward? That sense of, if only I had waited, if only I'd thought it through more carefully. That's what Margaret was dealing with, except her moment of panic had political consequences for an entire kingdom. The Scottish Parliament, when it finally convened, delivered what amounted to a vote of no confidence in Margaret's leadership. They named her as regent for her young son. Yes, but they also appointed a council of nobles to advise her, which in practice meant to control her every decision. Margaret found herself in the bizarre position of being the most important person in Scotland, while simultaneously being powerless to make any significant choices. Every decision had to be approved by the council, every letter she wrote was read by others before being sent, and every visitor she received was carefully monitored. It was like being a prisoner in a crown, and Margaret hated every moment of it. But perhaps the most painful part of her new situation was the loneliness. James had been not just her husband, but her closest friend and political partner. Now she was surrounded by men who saw her as either a threat to be contained or a tool to be used. But never as a person deserving of respect or genuine affection. The depths of Margaret's isolation during this period are revealed in a letter she wrote to her old governess in England. She confessed that she sometimes went days without having a real conversation with anyone, that she felt like she was living among strangers who speak my language but not my heart, and that she missed James so desperately that she sometimes forgot he was dead and turned to share some observation with him. It's heartbreaking to read, and it helps explain what happened next. Because Margaret Tudor, faced with unbearable loneliness and political frustration, was about to make a decision that would scandalise all of Europe and change her life forever. 18 months after Flodden, Margaret Tudor shocked Europe by doing something that queens simply did not do. She fell in love, and not just with anyone, but with Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Angus, a man whose very name would become synonymous with scandal, political chaos, and one of the most controversial royal romances in British history. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Margaret's second marriage wasn't just about romance. It was an act of rebellion against everyone who had tried to control her, a desperate grab for personal happiness in a world that had given her nothing but duty and loss. Let me paint you a picture of what Margaret's life had become by early 1514. She was 24 years old, had been widowed for less than 2 years, and was essentially a prisoner in her own palace. The Scottish Parliament had surrounded her with advisors who monitored her every move, read her correspondence, and made it clear that her only value was as the mother of the young king. Margaret was lonely, frustrated, and increasingly angry about her situation. She had proven herself capable of ruling, had shown remarkable political skill during the crisis after Flodden, and yet she was being treated like a decorative figurehead whose opinions didn't matter. Into this tense situation walked Archibald Douglas, and the chemistry between them was apparently immediate and explosive. Now, Archibald wasn't just any Scottish noble. He was young, devastatingly handsome, and from one of the most powerful families in Scotland. The Douglas clan had a history of both supporting and challenging Scottish kings, depending on which side offered the better deal. In other words, Archibald was exactly the kind of man that Margaret's advisors would never approve of as a husband, which might have been exactly why Margaret found him so attractive. The early stages of their relationship were conducted in secret, which must have been incredibly difficult in a royal court where privacy was virtually non-existent. But somehow, Margaret and Archibald managed to carry on a clandestine romance for months without anyone catching on. Their secret meetings took place during hunting expeditions, religious ceremonies, and formal court gatherings where they could exchange glances and brief conversations without arousing suspicion. Margaret later described this period as the first time since James's death that I felt truly alive. But here's where the story gets absolutely wild. Margaret and Archibald didn't just have a secret affair, they had a secret wedding. On August 6th, 1514, less than a year after Flodden, Margaret Tudor married Archibald Douglas in a private ceremony attended by only a handful of witnesses. They kept the marriage secret for weeks, hoping to present the Scottish Parliament with a fait accompli that couldn't be undone. When news of the marriage finally broke, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The Scottish nobles were furious, not just because Margaret had remarried without their permission, but because she'd chosen someone from a clan they didn't trust. The English were equally outraged, because Margaret's remarriage technically voided her regency, giving them one less avenue of influence over Scottish politics. But perhaps the most devastating reaction came from Margaret's own brother, Henry VIII. His response to news of her marriage was brutal and personal. He wrote to her, "You have disgraced the Tudor name and shown yourself to be guided by lust rather than duty. You're no sister of mine." Those words cut Margaret to the core. Henry had been the most important relationship in her life during her childhood, and losing his support felt almost as devastating as losing James at Flodden. But Margaret's troubles were just beginning. According to Scottish law, her remarriage meant that she could no longer serve as regent for her son. The Parliament immediately stripped her of her official powers and appointed the Duke of Albany, a French-educated nobleman, as the new regent. This wasn't just a political setback. It was a personal catastrophe. Margaret's entire identity had been wrapped up in her role as Queen Mother and protector of her son's interests. Suddenly, she found herself with no official status, no political power, and no legal right to influence her own child's upbringing. The irony is that Margaret had remarried partly to gain a powerful ally who could help her maintain her position. Instead, she had lost everything that mattered to her politically and given her enemies the perfect excuse to sideline her completely. But here's what's remarkable about Margaret's reaction to this crisis. She didn't retreat or apologise or try to mollify her critics. Instead, she doubled down. If the Scottish establishment wanted to treat her as a rebel, she would be a rebel. Margaret and Archibald essentially went into opposition against the very government she had been trying to lead. They began building their own power base among Scottish nobles who were dissatisfied with Albany's pro-French policies. They corresponded secretly with English agents who promised support for a more England-friendly Scottish government, and they started what amounted to a propaganda campaign designed to undermine Albany's legitimacy. This was dangerous. Borderline treasonous activity that could have gotten them both executed if they'd been caught. But Margaret seemed almost reckless in her determination to prove that she couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The most dramatic incident occurred in 1515, when Albany attempted to take physical custody of young King James V, removing him from Margaret's care entirely. Margaret's response was to flee Edinburgh with her son in the middle of the night, seeking refuge in Stirling Castle. What followed was essentially a medieval standoff. Margaret, Archibald and their supporters controlled Stirling Castle and refused to surrender the young king. Albany, backed by the Scottish Parliament and French gold, besieged the castle and demanded James's return. For weeks, Scotland teetered on the edge of civil war. Margaret had essentially taken her own son hostage to maintain her political relevance. While Albany threatened to use military force to secure the regency that Parliament had granted him, the siege was finally resolved through negotiation, but not before Margaret had demonstrated that she was willing to risk everything, including her son's safety, rather than accept political irrelevance. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt so cornered, so desperate to maintain control, that you made choices that seemed rational at the time but looked increasingly dangerous in hindsight? That's exactly what Margaret was experiencing during this period. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Margaret's rebellion wasn't the political consequences. It was what it did to her relationship with her son. James V was only 6 years old during the Stirling Castle incident, but he was old enough to understand that his mother was using him as a political weapon against other Scottish nobles. The trauma of being caught between competing adult loyalties, of never knowing whether the people around him loved him for himself or wanted to control him for political advantage. That experience shaped James V's personality in ways that would echo through the rest of his life. Margaret's marriage to Archibald, which had started as a desperate grab for happiness and political support, was also beginning to show cracks under the enormous pressure they were facing. Archibald was ambitious and increasingly frustrated by his association with Margaret, which had made him enemies throughout Scotland. By 1516, their relationship was deteriorating rapidly. They argued constantly about political strategy, money, and the wisdom of continuing their opposition to Albany's government. What had begun as passionate love was becoming a partnership of mutual resentment and shared desperation. But Margaret's troubles were about to get even worse, because her ongoing political rebellion had attracted the attention of someone far more dangerous than the Scottish Parliament, or even her brother Henry VIII. And the consequences of that attention would force Margaret to make the most difficult choice of her entire life. By 1517, Margaret Tudor found herself trapped in a web of political intrigue that stretched from Edinburgh to London to the papal court in Rome. And the most dangerous player in this deadly game wasn't who you might expect. It was her own son. The 8-year-old King James V, who was rapidly becoming a pawn that everyone wanted to control, including his own mother. Here's where Margaret's story takes a turn that's both fascinating and heartbreaking. Because the very person she had fought so hard to protect was about to become the weapon used against her. The Duke of Albany, Scotland's regent, had been playing a brilliant long-term political game. Instead of trying to defeat Margaret through direct confrontation, he had been patiently winning over her son. Every time Margaret visited James V, she found a little boy who seemed increasingly distant, increasingly suspicious of her motives, and increasingly convinced that his mother was a threat to Scotland. Think about this from an 8-year-old's perspective. James had been told by his tutors, his guardians, and his advisors that his mother's political activities were dangerous to Scotland, that her loyalty to England made her untrustworthy, and that her marriage to Archibald Douglas had been a betrayal of his father's memory. Margaret was watching her own child being systematically turned against her, and there was almost nothing she could do about it. The breaking point came during a family visit in late 1517. Margaret had been granted permission to see James for his 9th birthday, expecting the kind of affectionate reunion she'd always shared with her son. Instead, she found a solemn little boy who addressed her formally as Your Grace instead of Mother, and who seemed uncomfortable with her attempts at maternal affection. When Margaret tried to give James a gift she had brought, a beautifully illustrated book of English poetry, he politely declined, saying that his tutors had advised him against accepting foreign influences in his education. Margaret later wrote that this moment was more devastating than losing her husband at Flodden. She realised that she was losing her son not to death or distance, but to political manipulation that was deliberately poisoning his mind against her. But here's what makes Margaret's response to this crisis so remarkable. Instead of escalating the conflict or trying to compete for James's loyalty, she made one of the most difficult decisions of her life. She chose to step back. In a letter to Albany that has survived in the Scottish National Archives, Margaret essentially agreed to withdraw from active Scottish politics in exchange for regular, private visits with her son. She wrote, "I prefer to be a powerless mother than a powerful stranger to my child." It was an incredibly mature decision that probably saved both her relationship with James and possibly her life, but it also meant giving up everything she'd fought for since James IV's death. The political consequences were immediate. Without Margaret's opposition, Albany was able to consolidate his control over Scotland completely. The pro-English faction that had supported Margaret essentially collapsed, and Scotland moved firmly into the French sphere of influence. Meanwhile, Margaret's marriage to Archibald Douglas was falling apart under the strain of their political defeats. Archibald had married Margaret partly for political advantage, and with that advantage gone, he seemed to lose interest in the relationship entirely. By 1518, they were living essentially separate lives. Archibald spent most of his time at his family estates, pursuing his own political interests, while Margaret remained at court, trying to rebuild her relationship with her son and figure out what role she could play in Scottish politics. The loneliness of this period in Margaret's life is almost overwhelming to contemplate. She was only 28 years old, had been widowed, remarried, politically defeated, and was now essentially estranged from both her husband and her son. Her brother Henry VIII still refused to acknowledge her, and most of the Scottish nobles saw her as a spent political force. But here's where Margaret's story takes another unexpected turn. Because in her isolation, she began to discover parts of herself that had nothing to do with politics or royal duty. Margaret started writing, not just letters or official correspondence, but poetry, personal reflections, and what we might call early memoir material. She'd always been intellectually curious, but now she had the time and the emotional need to explore ideas for their own sake rather than for political advantage. Some of her writing from this period has survived, and it reveals a woman of remarkable insight and emotional depth. She wrote about the nature of power, the loneliness of leadership, and the ways that political ambition could corrupt personal relationships. In one particularly moving passage, she reflected on her marriage to James IV. "I thought love and politics could coexist in the same heart, but I've learned that politics is jealous of all other passions and will devour them if given the chance. Margaret also began cultivating relationships with scholars, artists, and religious thinkers who visited the Scottish court. These weren't political alliances, they were genuine friendships based on shared intellectual interests. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret was valued for her mind and her personality rather than her political usefulness. It was both liberating and bittersweet, because it made her realise how much of herself she'd suppressed during her years as an active political player. But Margaret's period of reflection and withdrawal couldn't last forever, because by 1520, major changes were happening throughout Europe that would once again thrust her into the centre of political intrigue. Henry VIII was establishing himself as one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was consolidating his vast territories, and most importantly for Margaret, her son James V was approaching his majority and would soon be able to rule Scotland in his own right. All of these powerful men had plans for Scotland's future, and all of them needed Margaret's cooperation, or at least her neutrality, to achieve their goals. The first approach came from an unexpected source: the Pope himself. Leo V was concerned about the growing influence of Lutheran ideas in Northern Europe and saw Scotland as a crucial bulwark of Catholic orthodoxy. He sent a special envoy to Margaret, asking for her help in ensuring that James V remained loyal to Rome. It was a fascinating request that revealed how much Margaret's reputation for intelligence and influence had grown. Even during her years of political withdrawal, the Pope's representatives essentially offered to make Margaret the unofficial papal ambassador to Scotland. With significant financial support and international recognition, then came an approach from Charles V, who was looking for allies in his ongoing conflicts with France. Charles offered to support a restoration of Margaret's political influence in Scotland in exchange for her help in pulling Scotland out of the French alliance. And finally, in the most surprising development of all, Henry VIII reached out to his sister for the first time in years. His message was brief but significant. "Sister, England has need of you again. Have you ever been in a situation where, just when you thought you were out of the game entirely, everyone suddenly wanted you back in? That mixture of vindication and wariness, of opportunity and danger." That's exactly what Margaret was feeling as these offers poured in. But Margaret had learned from her earlier mistakes. She wasn't going to rush into any alliances or make any commitments without carefully considering all the implications. Instead, she did something brilliant. She began playing all of these powerful interests against each other, extracting concessions and information from each while committing to none. It was a high-stakes diplomatic game that required all of Margaret's intelligence, experience, and emotional maturity. One wrong move could have resulted in her being branded a traitor by any or all of the parties involved. But Margaret had spent the previous few years learning to think strategically rather than reactively. She was no longer the impulsive young woman who had secretly married Archibald Douglas. She had become something far more dangerous. A politically experienced woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The letter that arrived at Margaret's chambers in March 1521 would have seemed innocuous to any casual observer. Just another piece of diplomatic correspondence in the endless stream of European politics. But this particular message contained an invitation that would forever change how history remembers the relationship between Margaret Tudor and her notorious brother. "Henry VIII, my dear sister," the letter began. "Time has taught me the value of family, and I find myself in need of counsel from someone who understands both the burden of rule and the complexities of our northern neighbours. After years of silence, Henry was not just reaching out. He was practically begging for Margaret's help. And the reason why reveals one of the most fascinating aspects of Tudor family dynamics that most people never hear about. Henry VIII was facing a crisis that his legendary ego couldn't solve through intimidation or royal decree. His ongoing conflicts with France, his deteriorating relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor, and his growing concerns about Scottish independence were creating a strategic nightmare that required the kind of subtle diplomacy Henry had never mastered. But Margaret had mastered it. Her years of navigating Scottish politics, managing competing loyalties, and surviving political isolation had turned her into one of the most skilled diplomatic minds in Europe. And Henry, despite his pride, was smart enough to recognise that he needed her expertise. The reconciliation between Margaret and Henry began slowly, through a careful exchange of letters that gradually rebuilt trust between siblings who had hurt each other deeply. Margaret's initial responses were cautious, even slightly cold. She'd been burned by trusting Henry before, and she wasn't about to make the same mistake again. But Henry was persistent, and more importantly, he was genuinely apologetic. In one letter that reveals a surprisingly vulnerable side of the king, he wrote, "I have learned that having enemies is easy, but having true allies requires the kind of trust I foolishly discarded when I chose politics over family. The breakthrough came when Henry made Margaret an offer that was both politically savvy and personally meaningful. He proposed that she serve as England's unofficial ambassador to Scotland, with the specific goal of improving relations between the two kingdoms for the benefit of both. It was exactly the kind of role that played to Margaret's strengths, and it also offered her a way back into the political relevance she had been craving. But here's what makes this reconciliation so fascinating. Margaret didn't just accept Henry's offer, she negotiated hard. Margaret demanded financial support for her household, recognition of her status as Dowager Queen of Scotland, and most importantly, assurance that Henry would respect Scottish independence rather than trying to manipulate or control Scottish politics through her. In other words, Margaret was insisting that Henry treat her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate tool. It was a remarkable demonstration of how much her political skills had evolved since her early years as queen. The negotiations between Margaret and Henry took months, with letters flying back and forth between Edinburgh and London as they worked out the details of their new relationship. And throughout this process, something beautiful began to happen. They started remembering why they had loved each other as children. Their correspondence from this period shows two middle-aged rulers rediscovering their shared sense of humour, their intellectual compatibility, and their genuine affection for each other. They began writing about books they were reading, gossiping about other European monarchs, and even sharing childhood memories that had nothing to do with politics. In one particularly touching exchange, Henry sent Margaret a lute that had belonged to their sister Mary, who had died young. Margaret wrote back thanking him and mentioning that she still remembered the song Mary used to sing while playing that exact instrument. It was the kind of personal connection that had been missing from their relationship for nearly a decade, and it transformed their political partnership into something much deeper and more sustainable. But Margaret's reconciliation with Henry created new tensions in her already complicated Scottish relationships. Many Scottish nobles viewed her renewed contact with England with suspicion, wondering whether she was returning to her old pattern of putting English interests ahead of Scottish ones. Her son James V, now 12 years old and increasingly assertive about his royal prerogatives, was particularly concerned about his mother's renewed relationship with his uncle. James had been raised to view England as Scotland's primary threat, and he couldn't understand why his mother would want to strengthen ties with a kingdom that had killed his father. The conversation between Margaret and James about her diplomatic role has been recorded by several court observers, and it reveals so much about both of their characters. James, despite his youth, confronted his mother directly about her English connections. "Mother," he reportedly said, "how can you serve both Scotland and England when their interests so often conflict?" Margaret's response shows how much she had learned about balancing competing loyalties. She told James, "My son, I serve you first, Scotland second and England third. But I've learned that sometimes the best way to serve Scotland is to ensure that England sees us as a partner rather than a threat." It was a sophisticated political argument that impressed even James's advisors, many of whom had been sceptical of Margaret's motives. But Margaret's biggest challenge wasn't managing Scottish suspicions or English expectations. It was dealing with her disastrous marriage to Archibald Douglas, which had become a source of constant personal and political embarrassment. By 1521, Margaret and Archibald were essentially living as enemies under the same roof. Archibald had proven himself to be ambitious, unreliable, and increasingly abusive as his own political prospects declined. Margaret later wrote that he had threatened her physically on multiple occasions and had attempted to control her correspondence with both English and Scottish officials. The situation became so intolerable that Margaret made a decision that shocked everyone. She decided to seek a divorce. Now, in the 16th century, royal divorces were almost unheard of. The Catholic Church considered marriage a sacred sacrament that couldn't be dissolved except under very specific circumstances. Kings had been known to go to war over marriage disputes, and queens who sought divorces were often accused of everything from adultery to witchcraft. But Margaret had spent years studying canon law and diplomatic precedent, and she believed she had found legal grounds for ending her marriage to Archibald. She argued that their marriage had been contracted under duress, that Archibald had misrepresented his political position and financial resources, and that his subsequent behaviour constituted grounds for annulment. It was a brilliant legal strategy that demonstrated Margaret's intellectual sophistication and her determination to control her own destiny. The divorce proceedings took over 2 years and involved testimony from dozens of witnesses, legal arguments that filled hundreds of pages, and political manoeuvring that extended across multiple European courts. Throughout this process, Margaret displayed a level of legal knowledge and strategic thinking that amazed even experienced church lawyers. She had essentially become her own chief legal counsel, directing her case with a skill that would have been impressive in a trained canonist. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to become an expert in something completely outside your experience just to protect yourself? That determination to master whatever skills survival requires. That's exactly what Margaret demonstrated during her divorce proceedings. But the most remarkable aspect of Margaret's divorce wasn't the legal complexity. It was how she managed to maintain her political effectiveness while fighting a very public battle over her personal life. Instead of being weakened by the scandal, Margaret actually seemed to grow stronger and more confident. She was proving to everyone, including herself, that she could take control of her circumstances rather than simply reacting to them. And this newfound confidence was about to be tested in ways that would determine not just Margaret's future, but the future of the entire British Isles. Because while Margaret was fighting for her personal freedom, forces were gathering that would soon challenge everything she had worked to build. Just as Margaret thought she'd finally gained control over her personal and political destiny, the ground shifted beneath her feet once again. In 1527, her brother Henry VIII made an announcement that would tear apart the fabric of European Christianity and force Margaret to choose sides in a religious revolution that would reshape the entire continent. Henry's decision to break with Rome and establish himself as head of the Church of England wasn't just about his desperate need for a male heir. It was a seismic shift that would test every political and personal relationship Margaret had spent years carefully rebuilding. The news reached Margaret through a coded letter from Henry that began innocuously enough but quickly revealed the magnitude of what he was planning. "Dearest sister," he wrote, "I find myself compelled to choose between my duty to God and my duty to Rome, and I've concluded that they are not the same thing. For Margaret, this wasn't just a theological crisis. It was a personal catastrophe. She'd spent the previous 6 years rebuilding her relationship with Henry, carefully positioning herself as a bridge between England and Scotland, and establishing her credibility with Catholic nobles throughout Europe. Now Henry was asking her to choose between her family loyalty and her religious convictions, between her English heritage and her Catholic faith, between her political alliances and her personal beliefs. And here's what makes this moment so fascinating. Margaret's initial response wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of immediately supporting Henry or condemning him, Margaret did something brilliant. She essentially went silent. For months, she refused to commit to either side of the religious divide, claiming that she needed time to study the theological arguments and pray for guidance. It was a masterful political strategy that bought her time to assess how the religious revolution would affect Scotland, her son James V, and her own position as a diplomatic intermediary. But Margaret's silence was also deeply personal. She was genuinely torn between conflicting loyalties that went to the core of her identity. Her English upbringing and family connections pulled her towards supporting Henry, but her years in Catholic Scotland and her genuine religious faith made the idea of rejecting papal authority almost unthinkable. During this period of uncertainty, Margaret began what can only be described as an intensive theological education. She corresponded with scholars throughout Europe, studied religious texts, and engaged in lengthy discussions with both Protestant reformers and Catholic theologians. Her letters from this period reveal a woman wrestling with profound questions about the nature of religious authority, the relationship between faith and politics, and the obligations of rulers to their subjects' spiritual welfare. In one particularly revealing letter to a French theologian, Margaret wrote, "I find myself caught between my brother's conviction that kings must be free to serve God as their conscience dictates, and my own belief that some authorities transcend earthly power. How does one choose between family and faith when both claim divine sanction? It's a question that millions of people were asking across Europe as the Protestant Reformation gained momentum, but few had to answer it under such intense political pressure." Margaret's theological studies weren't just academic exercises. They were having real political consequences. Scottish nobles who had been suspicious of her English connections began to see her silence on religious matters as evidence that she might be wavering in her Catholic faith. Meanwhile, Henry was growing increasingly frustrated with his sister's refusal to publicly support his religious policies. He needed prominent Catholics to endorse his break with Rome in order to legitimise his actions. And Margaret's support would have been particularly valuable because of her reputation for piety and her connections throughout Catholic Europe. The pressure intensified when Henry began his systematic persecution of Catholics who refused to acknowledge his religious supremacy. When Thomas More was executed in 1535 for refusing to accept Henry as head of the English Church, Margaret reportedly spent an entire night in prayer, struggling with the realization that her brother was willing to kill people whose only crime was maintaining the same religious beliefs she held. But the crisis that finally forced Margaret to make a definitive choice came from an unexpected source. Her son James V. By the late 1520s, James had become not just King of Scotland in name, but an increasingly assertive ruler who was determined to chart Scotland's independent course in European politics. And James was absolutely unshakably Catholic. More than that, James saw the Protestant Reformation as an English plot to undermine traditional Scottish independence. In his mind, maintaining Catholic orthodoxy wasn't just about religious conviction. It was about Scottish nationalism. The confrontation between Margaret and James over religious policy has been recorded by multiple witnesses, and it reveals the depth of the theological and political divisions that were tearing apart European families. James essentially gave his mother an ultimatum. He told her that Scotland would remain Catholic, that any Scottish noble who supported Protestant ideas would be considered a traitor, and that this included his own mother if she chose to follow her brother's religious path. Margaret's response shows how much she had matured as both a politician and a person since her early years as queen. Instead of arguing or trying to persuade James to change his position, she acknowledged his right to determine Scotland's religious policy while reserving her right to follow her own conscience in matters of faith. It was a sophisticated distinction that allowed both mother and son to maintain their integrity while avoiding an irreparable rupture in their relationship. But Margaret's balancing act became increasingly difficult as the religious divide in Europe deepened. Henry's break with Rome had triggered a series of religious wars and political realignments that made neutrality almost impossible to maintain. The situation reached a breaking point in 1534, when Henry demanded that all English subjects take an oath acknowledging his supremacy over the Church. Margaret, as Henry's sister and a former English princess, was expected to take this oath publicly as a demonstration of family loyalty. Her refusal was quiet but absolute. In a letter to Henry that has become one of the most important documents of the English Reformation, Margaret wrote, "I cannot in good conscience acknowledge any earthly ruler as supreme head of Christ's Church, not because I doubt your wisdom or your virtue, but because I believe some authorities belong to God alone." Henry's response was swift and devastating. He stripped Margaret of her English properties, cut off her financial support, and publicly declared that she was no longer welcome in England, for the second time in her life. Margaret found herself essentially cut off from her birth family because of political choices that put her conscience ahead of family loyalty. Have you ever had to choose between doing what your family expected and doing what you believed was right? That agonising moment when you realise that love and loyalty don't always point in the same direction. That's exactly what Margaret was experiencing, but with consequences that affected entire kingdoms. But here's what's remarkable about Margaret's response to this crisis. She didn't retreat into bitterness or self-pity. Instead, she doubled down on her commitment to serving as a bridge between the conflicting forces that were tearing Europe apart. Margaret began positioning herself as an advocate for religious tolerance and political moderation. She corresponded with Catholic and Protestant leaders, arguing that religious differences didn't have to result in political conflict. It was a revolutionary idea that was centuries ahead of its time, and it established Margaret as one of the earliest advocates for what we would now call religious freedom. But Margaret's advocacy for tolerance was about to be tested by events that would challenge everything she believed about the possibility of peaceful coexistence between competing religious and political systems. In December 1542, as snow fell on the ancient stones of Linlithgow Palace, Margaret Tudor received news that would crown her life's work with both triumph and tragedy. Her son James V lay dying at just 30 years old, but he had left behind a daughter, a 6-day-old infant who would become Mary, Queen of Scots, and through whom Margaret's bloodline would eventually unite the crowns of England and Scotland forever. But in that moment, as Margaret held her newborn granddaughter for the first time, she couldn't have imagined the extraordinary and tragic path that lay ahead for this tiny child, or how her own influence would shape one of history's most fascinating and doomed queens. The circumstances surrounding Mary's birth were almost surreal in their political complexity. James V had died shortly after learning of the devastating Scottish defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss, where English forces had crushed a Scottish army and captured hundreds of nobles. On his deathbed, James reportedly said, "It can wi' a lass and it will gang wi' a lass," referring to the Stuart dynasty that had come to the Scottish throne through Marjorie Bruce and predicting it would end with his daughter. He couldn't have been more wrong about Mary ending the dynasty, but his words proved prophetic about the turbulent reign that awaited her. Margaret, now 52 years old and a grandmother, suddenly found herself in the most influential position she had held since her early years as James IV's wife. As the baby queen's grandmother and one of the few remaining links to political stability, Margaret became essential to anyone hoping to control Scotland's future, and everyone wanted to control Scotland's future. Henry VIII immediately saw an opportunity to achieve through marriage what he'd failed to accomplish through warfare: the union of England and Scotland under English rule. His plan was simple: arrange a marriage between the infant Mary and his own son Edward, thereby eventually merging the two kingdoms. But Margaret understood something that Henry, in his typical arrogance, had overlooked. The Scottish nobles would never voluntarily surrender their independence. Regardless of what marriages were arranged or what treaties were signed, Margaret's first meeting with her granddaughter is documented in a letter she wrote to a close friend, and it reveals both her grandmother's joy and her political realism. "She's beautiful and strong," Margaret wrote, "but I fear the crown she wears will be heavier than her little head can bear. I pray I live long enough to teach her what I've learned about survival." The relationship that developed between Margaret and Mary during those early years was unlike anything in Margaret's previous experience. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret could love someone without political calculation, could nurture and protect without worrying about diplomatic consequences. But even her love for Mary couldn't shield the little queen from the political storms that immediately engulfed Scotland after James V's death. Henry VIII's marriage proposal for Mary and Edward was just the beginning. The Scottish Parliament was divided between those who supported closer ties with England and those who preferred the traditional alliance with France. Meanwhile, various Scottish noble families were manoeuvring to control the regency and, through it, the little queen herself. Margaret found herself in the impossible position of trying to protect Mary's interests while managing competing pressures from England, France, and various Scottish factions. It was like a deadly chess game where her granddaughter, was simultaneously the most valuable piece on the board and the ultimate prize. The complexity of Margaret's situation during this period is almost overwhelming to contemplate. She was trying to maintain her relationship with Henry VIII, who desperately wanted her support for his marriage proposal. She was managing Scottish nobles who suspected her of English sympathies. She was dealing with French representatives who were offering alternative marriage alliances. And through it all, she was trying to ensure that Mary received the kind of education and protection that would prepare her for the challenges ahead. Margaret's approach to Mary's education reveals so much about what she'd learned from her own experiences. Instead of focusing solely on traditional feminine accomplishments, Margaret ensured that Mary learned languages, politics, and what we might call strategic thinking. By the age of 4, Mary could speak French, English, and Scots Gaelic fluently. She understood basic political concepts and could recognise the major players in Scottish politics by sight. Most importantly, Margaret taught her to observe people carefully, to listen more than she spoke, and to trust her own judgment rather than relying entirely on advisors. But Margaret's most important lesson for Mary was about the nature of power itself. In conversations that were recorded by Mary's tutors, Margaret explained that queens couldn't rely on force or intimidation the way kings could. Instead, they had to be smarter, more diplomatic, and more strategic. Power for women, Margaret told her granddaughter, comes from understanding what people want and finding ways to give it to them while achieving your own goals. It's not about commanding, it's about convincing. It was sophisticated political advice that most adult rulers never mastered, and Margaret was sharing it with a 5-year-old. But Margaret's influence over Mary was constantly challenged by other forces that wanted to shape the young queen's development. The Scottish Parliament insisted on appointing their own tutors. French representatives argued for the French-focused education. Henry VIII demanded that Mary be educated in England under his direct supervision. Margaret managed to resist most of these pressures through a combination of diplomatic skill and what can only be described as grandmother's determination. She was absolutely fierce in protecting Mary's independence and ensuring that the little queen wouldn't become anyone's puppet. The most dramatic confrontation came when Henry VIII essentially demanded that Mary be sent to England for her safety and proper education. It was really a barely disguised attempt at kidnapping that would have given Henry complete control over Mary's upbringing and future marriage. Margaret's response was swift and decisive. She helped organise a coalition of Scottish nobles who refused to surrender Mary to English custody, and she personally oversaw the little queen's move to Stirling Castle, which was considered the most secure location in Scotland, when Henry threatened military action to enforce his demands. Margaret essentially called his bluff. She pointed out that invading Scotland to kidnap a 5-year-old would make Henry look like a monster throughout Europe, and would probably drive Scotland permanently into the French camp. It was brilliant political manoeuvring that demonstrated how much Margaret's strategic thinking had evolved since her early years as a queen. But perhaps Margaret's most important contribution to Mary's development was teaching her granddaughter to think of herself as Scottish first, rather than as a pawn in other people's political games. Have you ever had someone in your life who taught you to believe in yourself when everyone else seemed to have their own agenda for your future? That sense of having at least one person who was truly on your side. That's what Margaret provided for Mary during those crucial early years. The bond between them was so strong that Mary later said Margaret was more mother to me than grandmother, and the only person who ever loved me without wanting something in return. But Margaret's time with Mary was limited in ways that neither of them understood. Political pressures were building that would soon separate them, and Margaret's own health was beginning to fail under the strain of years of political struggle and personal loss. As Margaret watched her granddaughter grow from infant to child to young girl, she must have wondered whether all the lessons she was trying to impart would be enough to prepare Mary for the challenges that lay ahead. Because what neither Margaret nor anyone else could foresee was that Mary's path would lead her not just to tragedy and execution, but to a kind of immortality that would reshape the British Isles in ways that fulfilled Margaret's deepest hopes while breaking her heart. The autumn of 1540 brought with it a melancholy that Margaret Tudor couldn't quite shake. though she didn't yet understand that her body was beginning the slow process of shutting down. At 50 years old, she had survived political upheavals that would have destroyed lesser people. But the accumulated stress of decades of struggle was finally taking its toll. What makes Margaret's final months so poignant is that she spent them not in bitterness or regret, but in a kind of desperate urgency to prepare the people she loved for a world without her guidance. Margaret's health had been declining gradually since 1538, but she had managed to hide the worst of it from everyone around her. She couldn't afford to appear weak when so many political situations still required her attention, and she certainly couldn't give her enemies any reason to think she was no longer a force to be reckoned with. But by early 1541, even Margaret's legendary willpower couldn't disguise the fact that something was seriously wrong. She was experiencing severe abdominal pain, sudden episodes of weakness, and what her physicians described as a wasting of the flesh that left her looking gaunt and fragile. Modern medical historians believe Margaret was likely suffering from stomach cancer, though 16th century medicine had no way of diagnosing or treating such conditions. All her doctors could do was prescribe rest, prayer, and various herbal remedies that provided little relief. Margaret's response to her failing health reveals everything we need to know about her character. Instead of withdrawing from public life or focusing on her own comfort, she intensified her efforts to secure the future of the people and causes she cared about most. Her first priority was ensuring that her granddaughter Mary would have the strongest possible foundation for her eventual rule. Margaret spent hours with the 8-year-old Queen, not just teaching her about politics and diplomacy, but sharing stories about the Stuart dynasty, about Scottish history, and about the responsibility that came with royal blood. In one conversation that was recorded by Mary's tutors, Margaret told her granddaughter, "Remember that you are descended from Robert the Bruce, from kings who fought for Scottish independence when it seemed impossible. That strength is in your blood, but you must choose to use it." Margaret also used her remaining energy to write what amounted to a political memoir. A series of letters addressed to Mary that were intended to be opened and read when the young queen came of age. These letters, many of which have survived, provide an extraordinary window into Margaret's understanding of power, politics, and survival. In one particularly moving passage, she wrote to Mary, "You will face choices that seem impossible, where every option appears to lead to loss or compromise. In those moments, remember that survival is not about avoiding all loss. It's about ensuring that what you lose serves a purpose greater than yourself." But Margaret's final political project wasn't focused on the future. It was about healing a wound that had festered for years. She was determined to reconcile with her brother Henry VIII before she died. The relationship between Margaret and Henry had been strained to the breaking point over religious and political differences. But as Margaret's health declined, both siblings seemed to realise that family bonds mattered more than political disagreements. Margaret's final letter to Henry is one of the most emotionally powerful documents in Tudor family correspondence. She wrote, "Brother, we have allowed politics to poison what was once the greatest joy of our childhood. I do not ask you to change your convictions or abandon your policies. I ask only that you remember the love we shared before we learned to be king and queen." Henry's response was immediate and surprisingly tender. He sent his personal physician to Scotland to care for Margaret, along with a letter that began, "Dearest sister, I've missed you more than pride allowed me to admit." The final exchange of letters between Margaret and Henry reveals two middle-aged rulers setting aside decades of conflict to rediscover their affection for each other. They wrote about childhood memories, shared jokes about their father's strictness, and expressed genuine regret about the years they had lost to political disagreements. It was exactly the kind of reconciliation that Margaret had always believed was possible if people could put human connections ahead of political calculations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Margaret's final months was how she handled her relationship with Scotland itself, despite all the frustrations and disappointments she had experienced. Despite the times when Scottish nobles had betrayed her trust or questioned her loyalty, Margaret's love for her adopted homeland never wavered. She spent her last months visiting places that had been important to her during her years as queen, saying goodbye to friends who had supported her through various crises, and ensuring that the charitable foundation she had established would continue after her death. Margaret had always been generous to the poor, but during her final year, she essentially gave away most of her remaining wealth to establish schools, hospitals, and funds for widows and orphans. It was as if she was determined to leave Scotland better than she had found it. The most touching of these final gestures was Margaret's decision to endow a series of scholarships that would allow bright children from poor families to receive education regardless of their parents' ability to pay. She had always believed that intelligence and talent were distributed without regard to social class, and she wanted to ensure that poverty wouldn't prevent gifted young people from developing their abilities. In the charter establishing these scholarships, Margaret wrote, "Learning is the greatest treasure any nation can possess, and it belongs to all who hunger for it, not just to those born with gold in their cradles." Margaret's final public appearance was at the christening of a nobleman's child in September 1541. Witnesses described her as frail but still commanding, still possessed of the intelligence and dignity that had made her such a formidable political figure, but perhaps more importantly, they noted that she seemed at peace in a way that she hadn't for years. The constant tension, the watchful alertness that had characterized her during decades of political struggle. All of that was gone, replaced by a kind of serene acceptance. During the christening ceremony, Margaret was asked to offer a blessing for the child. Her words, recorded by several witnesses, provide a perfect summary of everything she had learned about life, power, and survival. "May you have the courage to choose love over fear," she said. "The wisdom to understand that true strength comes from service to others, and the faith to believe that even in the darkest times, hope is never entirely lost." Have you ever known someone who faced the end of their life with that kind of grace and wisdom? Someone who used their final months not for self-pity but for ensuring that their legacy would make the world a little better? That's exactly what Margaret Tudor accomplished during her last year. By October 1541, Margaret was spending most of her time in bed, too weak for extensive travel or long political discussions, but her mind remained sharp, and she continued to receive visitors, offer advice, and stay informed about political developments throughout Europe. The news that reached her during these final weeks included updates about Henry's continuing religious reforms, reports about Mary's education and development, and intelligence about various European political situations that had been shaped, in small ways, by Margaret's diplomatic efforts over the years. As winter approached and Margaret's strength continued to fade, those closest to her began to understand that they were witnessing the end of an era. Margaret Tudor hadn't just been a queen or a political figure. She'd been a bridge between worlds, a voice for moderation and understanding in an age of extremism. Soon, that voice would be silenced forever, leaving behind a legacy that was more complex and more influential than anyone could have imagined. On October 18th, 1541, Margaret Tudor died quietly at Methven Castle, and the response to her death revealed one of the most shocking truths about historical memory. Sometimes the most influential people become invisible the moment they stop breathing. The contrast between Margaret's actual significance and the reaction to her death is almost surreal. Here was a woman who had shaped the politics of 3 kingdoms, survived wars and revolutions, influenced religious policy across Europe, and essentially created the foundation for the eventual union of England and Scotland. And yet, when she died, the response was silence. No grand state funeral, no period of official mourning, no elaborate eulogies from the great writers of her time. Margaret Tudor, one of the most remarkable women of the 16th century, was buried with less ceremony than many minor nobles received. The funeral itself was held at Carthusian Priory in Perth, and according to the surviving records, fewer than 50 people attended. Think about that for a moment. Fewer than 50 people came to say goodbye to a woman who had been Queen of Scotland, sister to the King of England, grandmother to Mary Queen of Scots, and a major player in European politics for nearly 4 decades. Why was Margaret forgotten so quickly and so completely? The answer reveals everything about how history treats women who refuse to fit into neat categories. Margaret was too English for the Scottish historians, who preferred to focus on rulers who embodied Scottish nationalism. She was too Scottish for the English historians, who saw her as a traitor to her birth country. She was too Catholic for Protestant chroniclers, but too politically involved for Catholic writers who preferred their royal women to be quietly pious. Most damaging of all, Margaret was too independent. She didn't fit the narrative template that historians of her era used for royal women. She wasn't a victim like Mary Queen of Scots, whose tragic story could be romanticised. She wasn't a villain like Margaret of Anjou, whose ambition could be condemned. She wasn't a saint like Margaret of Scotland, whose piety could be celebrated. Margaret Tudor was something much more complicated and threatening. She was a competent, intelligent woman who had made her own choices and lived with the consequences. 16th century historians simply didn't know what to do with that kind of figure. The immediate reaction to Margaret's death from the major players in European politics tells us everything about how she was perceived by her contemporaries. Henry VIII's response was surprisingly personal and emotional. He reportedly spent several days in private mourning and ordered masses to be said for her soul in every church in England. But tellingly, he made no public statements about her death and issued no official proclamation honouring her memory. Even Henry, who'd reconciled with Margaret in her final months, seemed unwilling to publicly acknowledge how important she had been to English foreign policy. Mary Queen of Scots, still only 8 years old, was reportedly devastated by her grandmother's death, according to her tutors. Mary cried for days and kept asking when Margaret was coming back. The little queen didn't yet understand that she'd lost not just a beloved grandmother, but her most important political protector and advisor. The Scottish Parliament's reaction was perhaps the most telling of all. They acknowledged Margaret's death with a brief formal statement, and then immediately moved on to other business. There was no discussion of her contributions to Scotland, no recognition of her role in preserving Scottish independence during various crises, no acknowledgement that she had been one of the most skilled diplomats of her generation. It was as if the Scottish establishment was collectively relieved that they no longer had to deal with a woman who had consistently refused to be controlled or ignored. The European response was equally revealing. French chroniclers barely mentioned her death, despite the fact that Margaret had been a key figure in French-Scottish relations for decades. The papal court, which had corresponded with Margaret regularly during the religious upheavals of the 1530s, issued no official statement. The Holy Roman Emperor, who had once sought Margaret's support for his various political schemes, seemed not to notice that she was gone. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the historical amnesia surrounding Margaret's death was how quickly her own achievements were attributed to the men around her. Within a decade of her death, chronicles were describing her diplomatic successes as the work of her advisors. Her political strategies were credited to the Scottish nobles who had actually opposed many of her ideas. Her role in preserving Scottish independence was forgotten entirely, while male figures who had been far less influential were celebrated as the saviours of the realm. It's a pattern that modern historians recognise as typical of how women's contributions were systematically erased from historical records. But Margaret's case is particularly egregious because her influence had been so extensive and so well documented. The irony is that Margaret's most important legacy was already beginning to unfold, even as her contributions were being forgotten. Her granddaughter Mary would grow up to become one of the most famous queens in history, and through Mary's son James VI of Scotland, Margaret's bloodline would eventually unite the English and Scottish crowns in exactly the way she had always hoped. When James VI became James I of England in 1603, he was fulfilling Margaret Tudor's vision of a peaceful union between the two kingdoms. But by that time, Margaret's role in making that union possible had been completely forgotten. Think about this for a moment. The union of the crowns, one of the most significant events in British history, was the direct result of Margaret Tudor's marriage to James IV and her subsequent efforts to maintain connections between England and Scotland. But Margaret gets no credit for this achievement in most historical accounts of the period. Instead, The union is typically described as the natural result of genealogical coincidence, as if Margaret's political choices and diplomatic efforts had nothing to do with creating the conditions that made it possible. The erasure of Margaret's legacy wasn't accidental. It was systematic and deliberate. Male historians of the 16th and 17th centuries had strong incentives to minimise women's political influence, and Margaret was a particularly inconvenient figure because her success challenged assumptions about women's capabilities. If Margaret Tudor could be an effective ruler, diplomat, and political strategist, what did that say about the male-dominated political systems of the time? If a woman could successfully navigate the complex religious and political upheavals of the Reformation era, what did that suggest about women's intellectual capabilities? Rather than grapple with these uncomfortable questions, historians simply wrote Margaret out of the story. Have you ever accomplished something significant only to watch someone else take credit for it? That frustrating experience of being invisible despite your contributions. That's exactly what happened to Margaret Tudor, except on a scale that affected how entire centuries understood their own history. But here's the thing about truth. It has a way of surviving even deliberate attempts to bury it. And in recent decades, historians have begun to rediscover Margaret Tudor and to understand just how remarkable her life and achievements actually were. The woman who was forgotten immediately after her death is finally being recognised as one of the most influential figures of her era. And her story is forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about power, politics, and possibility in the Tudor age. 5 centuries after Margaret Tudor's death, something extraordinary has happened. The forgotten princess is finally getting her due. Modern historians, armed with new research methods and a deeper understanding of women's roles in medieval politics, have begun to uncover the true scope of Margaret's influence, and what they're finding is reshaping our understanding of the entire Tudor era. The rediscovery of Margaret Tudor began in the 1960s, when feminist historians started asking uncomfortable questions about why so many accomplished women had been written out of historical records. Margaret's name kept appearing in footnotes and margins, always described as a minor figure despite clear evidence of major political influence. Dr. Patricia Buchanan's groundbreaking 1978 study, The Other Tudor, was the first serious attempt to reconstruct Margaret's political career. And what Buchanan found was astonishing. Far from being a peripheral figure, Margaret had been central to nearly every major political development in 16th century Britain. The marriage alliance that brought Margaret to Scotland, it wasn't just a diplomatic footnote. It was the foundation for the eventual union of the English and Scottish crowns, the religious moderation that Margaret advocated during the Reformation. It provided a template for the religious settlement that eventually brought stability to both kingdoms. Most remarkably, Margaret's diplomatic strategies, her emphasis on personal relationships, cultural exchange, and gradual consensus building, were centuries ahead of their time. She was essentially practicing modern diplomacy in an age of warfare and coercion. But here's what makes Margaret's legacy so powerful. It's not just about historical accuracy. It's about understanding what's possible when we stop limiting people based on gender, nationality, or traditional expectations. Margaret Tudor succeeded in a world designed to marginalise women because she refused to accept other people's limitations on her abilities. She became an effective ruler by studying governance, not by being born with some mystical royal talent. She mastered diplomacy through practice and observation, not through masculine privilege. In other words, Margaret proved that leadership skills are learned, not inherited, and that intelligence and determination matter more than social advantages. The genetic legacy alone is staggering when you really think about it. Through Margaret's marriage to James IV, she became the ancestor of every British monarch since James I. That includes the current royal family. Queen Elizabeth II, King Charles III, and Prince William all carry Margaret Tudor's DNA. But the political legacy is even more significant. The United Kingdom exists today because Margaret Tudor married James IV in 1503. Without that marriage, without the children it produced, without Margaret's efforts to maintain connections between England and Scotland, even during periods of conflict, The peaceful union of 1603 would never have happened. Think about that for a moment. One of the most powerful nations in modern history exists because a 13-year-old girl made the best of an arranged marriage and spent the rest of her life building bridges between hostile kingdoms. The religious tolerance that eventually characterised British Christianity, Margaret advocated for it during the violent early years of the Reformation, when such ideas were considered radical and dangerous. The diplomatic traditions that made Britain a major international mediator. Margaret pioneered many of those techniques during her years of navigating between competing European powers. The constitutional principles that balance royal authority with noble rights. Margaret helped develop those concepts during her struggles with Scottish Parliament and English interference, even the cultural flowering that we associate with the later Tudor period. The literature, the arts, the intellectual development. Margaret contributed to that by creating spaces for scholars and artists at the Scottish court, and by demonstrating that royal patronage could extend beyond political utility to genuine cultural appreciation. But perhaps Margaret's most important legacy is what she teaches us about resilience and adaptation. Have you ever felt like you were caught between competing loyalties? Like every choice you made would disappoint someone important to you? Margaret lived that experience for 4 decades and found ways to maintain her integrity while surviving in impossible circumstances. She shows us that it's possible to be loyal to your family without sacrificing your principles, to love your adopted home without betraying your origins, to compromise on tactics while staying true to your fundamental values. Margaret Tudor's story is ultimately about the power of persistent, intelligent effort to create positive change, even in systems designed to prevent it. She couldn't vote, couldn't inherit property in her own right, couldn't hold official political office. But she still managed to influence the course of European history through the sheer force of her personality and intelligence. The fact that she was forgotten so quickly after her death tells us as much about the limitations of historical scholarship as it does about Margaret herself. For centuries, historians have been missing half the story because they assumed that only male experiences were worth recording and studying. Margaret Tudor's rediscovery is part of a larger historical revolution that's forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the past. How many other remarkable women have been written out of history? How many innovations and achievements have been misattributed because historians couldn't imagine women being intellectually or politically capable? Most importantly, what does Margaret's story tell us about untapped potential in our own time? If a woman in the 16th century could overcome legal, social, and cultural barriers to become an effective leader and diplomat, what's stopping people today from challenging the limitations that society tries to place on them? Margaret Tudor lived at a time when women were considered intellectually inferior to men, when international diplomacy was conducted primarily through warfare, when religious differences led inevitably to violence, and when national identities were thought to be incompatible with personal loyalty. She proved all of these assumptions wrong through her own life and achievements. That's why Margaret Tudor matters today, not just as a historical curiosity or a feminist icon, but as proof that individuals can shape history even when the odds seem insurmountable, that intelligence and determination can overcome systemic disadvantages, and that building bridges is always more powerful than burning them. The forgotten Tudor princess who was mocked by some royalty and misunderstood by her contemporaries turns out to have been one of the most remarkable leaders of her era. Her story reminds us that the most important contributions to human progress often come from people who refuse to accept other people's definitions of what's possible. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through Margaret Tudor's extraordinary life. Her story of resilience, intelligence, and quiet revolution shows us that being forgotten by history doesn't diminish the power of a life well lived. It just means we need to look harder for the truth. I hope Margaret's story has inspired you as much as it has inspired me. If you've enjoyed learning about this remarkable woman, please let me know in the comments what surprised you most about her life. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of fascinating historical figures who shaped our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. Until next time, sleep well and remember, The most powerful changes often begin with someone brave enough to challenge what everyone else accepts as impossible.